Hey there, right on time. Come in. The candles are lit, the tea's still warm, and the archive's been creaking like it knows someone's about to open a book they probably shouldn't. Tonight, we're going hairy. Yes, werewolves. But not just the growly, shirt-ripping kind from movies. We're talking the old ones, the whispered-about ones. Stories scribbled in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Trials, curses, and transformations no one could quite explain, except maybe by blaming the moon. These aren't just monsters. They're metaphors, scapegoats, fears in fur coats. And the deeper you dig, the weirder it gets. So before we turn the page, if you enjoy these slow, strange, softly spoken stories about the creatures that live in old legends and even older shadows, do give this video a like. It helps others find their way here too. And if you'd like to join us for more, I'd be honored if you subscribed. Now then, where are you joining from tonight? A cold attic in Transylvania? A modern blanket fort? The foggy hills of your imagination? Wherever you are, welcome. You're safe here. The locks are enchanted, the tea's decaf, and the only howling you'll hear is probably just me, reading trial transcripts too dramatically. Long before werewolves were howling at Hollywood moons, they were skulking through the shadowed edges of much older stories. Tales passed from fire pit to fire pit, whispered in fear, awe, and something close to superstition. You see, the idea of humans turning into wolves didn't begin in Europe, or even with the moon. It started much earlier, in cultures where the boundary between animal and human was never quite so firm. In ancient Mesopotamia, around 2100 BCE, we already find fragments of werewolf belief. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest surviving texts, hints at shapeshifters and animal transformations. There's a tale of a woman who turns her lover into a wolf as punishment. Not quite a romantic comedy, but close. And in that moment, the mythic seed is planted, that a person might become a beast, either by choice, by curse, or by the cruel hand of a scorned partner. The ancient Greeks, ever fond of drama, took the idea and ran with it, on 4 legs. The myth of King Lycaon is perhaps the earliest full-fledged werewolf story in the Western tradition. Lycaon, a king of Arcadia, decided to test Zeus by serving him a meal of human flesh. As you might imagine, the king of the gods did not appreciate this culinary creativity. In rage, Zeus struck down Lycaon's sons and turned Lycaon himself into a wolf. Some say this is where the word lycanthropy comes from. Lycaon plus anthropos, Greek for human. It wasn't just a myth, it was a warning. If you act like a beast, the gods might just make you one. Moving westward in Celtic and Norse traditions, the line between warrior and beast was not only blurred, it was celebrated. The berserkers of Norse legend were warriors who entered battle in a trance-like fury, often described as donning wolf or bear pelts to take on the power of the animal. Some scholars believe these figures inspired early werewolf tales in Scandinavia, where men might become wolves during war or rage. In Irish lore, we find the Fáiled, noble werewolves who were guardians of children, wounded soldiers, and lost travelers. Not all wolf people were monsters. Some were protectors, operating in the liminal space between wild and civilized. In fact, these Irish shapeshifters were more folklore than fear, more bedtime story than battlefield threat. Back then, it wasn't always a curse. Sometimes it was a gift, a sacred transformation, a deep connection to nature or to ancestral spirits. But that, of course, would change. As Christianity spread across Europe, the old stories were rebranded. The forest, once a place of magic and transformation, became a place of danger. The wolf, once respected, became a symbol of sin, of gluttony, of the untamed and the godless. And the werewolf, he became a warning that there are things inside us that should not be let out. The fur is just beginning to bristle. As the medieval world took shape, wolves began to vanish from more than just the forests. They were scrubbed from stories too, or rather, twisted. The wolf became a symbol of evil, a creature in league with the devil. And if a man was found with too wild a look, or if he wandered too far from town, or if he howled at night for reasons no one could quite explain, suspicion followed. In medieval Europe, fear wore many masks: witches, heretics, demons. But few were as viscerally unsettling as the idea of a person who could slip their skin, become a beast, and stalk the night with claws instead of conscience. By the 15th and 16th centuries, werewolf trials erupted across parts of France, Germany, Switzerland, and Eastern Europe. Much like witch trials, they were a chaotic blend of rumor, religion, and paranoia. People were accused of lycanthropy for any number of reasons. A neighbor's sheep went missing. Strange tracks were found in the snow, or someone simply had a scar and a secret. One of the earliest and most infamous cases comes from 1521 in Poligny, France. Two men, Pierre Bergeau and Michel Verdun, were tried and executed for being werewolves. They confessed, under torture of course, to making a pact with the devil and receiving magical wolf skins that allowed them to transform. According to their testimony, they prowled the countryside, attacking livestock and children. Were they guilty, or simply desperate under the weight of interrogation, fear, and folklore? In 1589, a man named Peter Stumpp was accused of being a werewolf in Bedburg, Germany. His case became one of the most gruesome in European law. After being arrested and tortured, he confessed to turning into a wolf, consorting with a succubus, murdering animals and people, even his own family. He was executed in a brutal public spectacle. His story reads more like horror fiction than history, but it became a template for how werewolves were portrayed for centuries, as cursed, depraved, and consumed by bloodlust. But beneath the horror, there's something revealing. These werewolf trials weren't just about fear of monsters. They were about otherness, about who didn't belong, about punishing those who lived on the edge, geographically, socially, or spiritually. Being a werewolf wasn't always about fur and fangs. Sometimes it was about poverty, mental illness, being different in a time when difference was dangerous. And yet, the stories kept spreading. The idea of the werewolf became a kind of cultural shorthand for the monster within, a man who turns into a beast under pressure or temptation, a warning that no matter how much lace you sew onto your tunic, something primal still waits underneath. In the next stretch of our journey, we'll explore the strange blend of folk remedies, religious rituals, and scientific theories people once used to explain and sometimes cure the wolf within. The fear was real, but so too was the fascination. If the Middle Ages were a time to fear the werewolf, the early modern era became a time to fix it, or at least try. Once the fur had settled after the trials, communities across Europe still had to live with the lingering belief that the wolf might live next door. And so, in a strange blend of folklore, medicine, and theology, people turned to cures. Some were simple and superstitious. A sprig of wolfsbane tucked under a pillow, a silver amulet worn tight to the chest, prayers said at just the right moon phase. Others leaned toward the grotesque, drinking certain herbal brews that were more poison than potion, or applying salves meant to draw out the beast. In Eastern Europe, some believed that burning the skin of a suspected werewolf could break the curse, on the assumption that the fur came from an enchanted pelt. Others claimed that simply calling the werewolf by its Christian name 3 times would snap it back to human form. The logic was foggy, but the hope was real. Not everyone reached for garlic and candles. The church, unsurprisingly, had its own views. Werewolves were often categorized alongside witches and demons, and so the treatment was spiritual: confession, penance, exorcism. Some priests believed lycanthropy was a punishment for moral failing, while others argued it was pure illusion, a trick of the devil, not a transformation of flesh. Interestingly, not everyone assumed a werewolf wanted to be cured. In some Baltic traditions, people who shifted into wolves at night were thought to fight demons or retrieve stolen harvests. They weren't monsters, they were guardians. These so-called Livonian werewolves might return to church sore and tired after a supernatural brawl, but they weren't punished. They were respected. Secretly, of course. Then came the physicians. In the 17th century, the rise of natural philosophy, early science, offered new theories. Some began diagnosing lycanthropy as a mental illness rather than a mystical condition. The term clinical lycanthropy would eventually emerge, a rare psychiatric syndrome where a person believes they can transform into a wolf. One physician, Johann Weyer, was ahead of his time. He argued that many accused witches and werewolves were suffering from melancholy or delusions and deserved treatment, not torture. Sadly, his views weren't popular in an age more fond of tortures than therapy. Still, the tide had begun to turn. Slowly, werewolves were becoming less of a religious problem and more of a psychological one. But even with the rise of rationalism, the wolf never truly left the room. Because despite all the salves, exorcisms, and philosophical debates, something about the transformation, that primal breaking point between human and beast, remained deeply magnetic. Whether they were burned, blessed, or diagnosed, werewolves lingered in the collective imagination. And as the Enlightenment gave way to the Gothic era, that imagination would find new fuel in fog-drenched castles, crumbling ruins, and penny dreadfuls. The wolf was about to rise again, this time in ink and shadow. As Europe stepped into the 18th and 19th centuries, the tortures and trials dimmed, but the werewolf didn't disappear. Instead, it changed costumes, from parchment to pulp fiction, from whispered warnings to printed words. The rise of Gothic literature was a storm cloud of monsters. Vampires, phantoms, cursed castles, and slowly but surely, werewolves padded into the scene. They weren't always center stage, but they prowled in the margins, waiting for their moment. One of the earliest literary werewolves appeared in The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould, published in 1865. Part folklore compendium, part moral exploration, it catalogued real werewolf legends and tried to explain them. Baring-Gould treated the werewolf as a tragic figure, often mentally ill or spiritually cursed, walking a lonely path through fear and folklore. Then came the penny dreadfuls, cheap, serialized horror stories sold to the masses. Here, werewolves grew bloodier, more animal than man. These were no longer cursed souls in search of redemption. They were nightmares with jaws. By the early 20th century, cinema took over. In 1935, Universal Pictures released Werewolf of London, and in 1941, the more famous The Wolfman. This film defined much of what we associate with werewolves today. The full moon trigger, the silver bullet weakness, the tragic man-beast caught in a cycle he can't escape. Larry Talbot, the doomed protagonist of The Wolfman, was more than a monster. He was a metaphor, a man battling an inner darkness he couldn't control. The film struck a chord in a world still recovering from one world war and stumbling into another. The werewolf became the perfect figure for a society struggling with trauma, guilt, and rage. From there, the fur flew. Werewolves exploded across genres: horror, comedy, romance, even teen drama. In the 1980s, we got an American Werewolf in London and The Howling, both of which blended gore with psychological dread. The transformation scenes became spectacles: flesh stretching, bones snapping, humanity violently replaced. And then came the Twilight era, where werewolves became brooding heartthrobs in cut-off shorts. Less cursed soul, more gym membership. Say what you will, but it brought a whole new generation into the fold. At the same time, new storytellers began reclaiming old folklore. Indigenous authors wrote about shapeshifters from their traditions. Fantasy writers reimagined the werewolf as a misunderstood guardian. The beast began to evolve again. No longer just a monster, no longer just a man, but something in between, something we recognize. Because at the heart of it, the werewolf remains a perfect mirror. It reflects the fear of losing control, the anxiety of being watched, the tension between civilization and instinct. And whether it's howling in a forest or posing moodily on a book cover, it keeps asking us the same quiet question. What if the scariest thing about the monster is how much it still looks like us? Well, that's enough howling for one night. The fires burned low, the shadows are getting long, and the tea, if we're being honest, has gone entirely cold. Typical. But I hope you're feeling a little cozier now than when we started. A little more curious. A little more haunted. We've walked with wolf kings and cursed soldiers, through moonlit woods and fogged-up cinema screens. We've seen the werewolf punished, pitied, romanticized, even merchandised. And through it all, it's never stopped evolving, because it's never stopped reflecting us. Whether you see it as a symbol, a shadow, or a very hairy metaphor for things we don't talk about in daylight, the werewolf has a way of creeping back into the cultural bloodstream. Sometimes in books, sometimes on the big screen, and sometimes, maybe, just maybe, in that sound you think you hear when you're home alone and the wind gets clever. Thank you for spending this time in the archive with me. It means more than you know. If there's a monster you'd like us to explore next, drop it in the comments. We get the best suggestions from curious minds like yours. But for now, rest easy. The locks are holding, the fire's down to embers, and the full moon isn't due for weeks. Sleep well, friend, and try not to scratch